Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. And here I am.
Oh yeah, hi mate, how are you?
Pretty good. We have a special guest here tonight. We got George Gantz.
Oh, George.
Steve, how are you? Nice to meet you. Daniel, I know you.
It's nice to see you again. Just in. Very amateur setup I have here, as people keep on remarking upon.
Well, Daniel's the one with the big, holy cow! What is that? Where are you in space? Are you out in orbit?
This is the artistic side of me. So you got to see the orange colors coming from, that's the sunshine coming through, I guess, the orange, and it's the, the graphic design of the COVID and climate correlations. That's in the, I can't help myself. I have to I have to arrange things in a way that are, pleasing to the eye. So I think what I need to do is I need to send Steve one of these things called like a portable green screen. They could put behind him.
Yes, I've got one of those. Yeah. All the things you have to do to be presentable on the internet these days. If I had the time, okay, but life is too busy at the moment. I've got one of my underlings to go and do it for me. So excuse me while I go and become one of my underlings for 2 minutes to go and.
Yeah, we all know that. Yeah, we're in. So Steve, it is a pleasure to meet you, and I think I want to thank Daniel for the introduction and also the work he's done to help me move some of my projects forward. And I think, Daniel, one of the things that excited you is I'm about to begin a project on complexity and philosophy, complexity science and philosophy. And Daniel thought your Minsky techniques and approach is an example of that I'd be interested in knowing more about, and I am. So looks like we have another guest tonight. Hi, Scott.
Hi, Scott.
Hello. Oh, I'm visible. Great.
So let me give a little bit of background, Steve. So as George was alluding to, we've been working together on the PlanckSip site, which is my site, and then also Spiral Inquiry to some degree, because George is an owner of a site called spiralinquiry.org. And basically, we started collaborating on some written pieces, and we spent the majority of a year working on an E.O. Wilson tribute, I guess you'll say. Somewhat. And so what we were looking at were the two concepts of consilience and consciousness. And consilience was a Whewell term. The same fellow that came up with the idea of science, actually as a term, not the idea, not the idea itself, but just just the word. And so Wilhelm Whewell, I think, if it's German, it's the WH is more like a Y. But it's the Wilhelm Whewell came up with this idea of consilience. And Scott's really annoyed by consilience, but basically what it means is there's a jumping together of ideas, and what Wilson was trying to do was bridge together the social sciences, right, with the actual sciences. And E.O. Wilson has kind of challenged several of these kind of pathways that we know as, well, we'll just say epistemology, right? What we know to be real, because some of it is kind of like an uncovering, as somebody that's kind of leading a charge on the forefront of a paradigm shift, or so we've really kind of imagined over the last little while. Like where are those cracking points? Where are those breaking points? And I feel like I'm monopolizing the conversation here a little bit.
That's fine. It's good background, and I've just come from a conversation with a old colleague of mine where I think in 50 minutes I got 2 minutes worth in if I'm lucky. So I think you're going to give me more than 2 minutes. So keep chatting.
Okay. Well, basically the reason why I really wanted to pull you and George together is that George and I have developed a bit of a friendship, I think, just as you and I have. And basically, I think what George is trying to do is he's exploring the idea of complexity, and I think when we were trying to implement or discuss ideas of how to actually get Minsky out into the, from the ether down into the world, there was a pathway through engineering, and then there's also a pathway through, like complexity science,
Yeah.
and
To me, I mean, one thing which it's interesting, if you go back and read Hayek's 1956, I think it was, Nobel Prize speech, he actually tried to measure complexity back then and argued that one reason you couldn't have a model of the economy was because of complexity. And what he actually meant by complexity was what we now call complicated, lots and lots of moving parts, etc., etc. But the essence of complexity is fundamentally simplicity and nonlinear interactions. And what you find in economics is this, because neoclassicals are trying to maintain an equilibrium paradigm, they rule out by assumption the nonlinear impacts. And this is, as one of my fellow researchers in the area once said, it's like to have the idea of nonlinear social sciences is a bit like the idea of having non-elephant elephants, because he said nothing is linear. Absolutely nothing is linear. When you push anything to its limit, cannot be linear. So only in a very limited bounds does linear thinking make sense. And when you look at social interactions, virtually everything, only a small amount of it can be handled by reductionism and the assumption of linearity in that reductionism. Whereas economics is just completely dominated by reductionism and is imposing linearity. And then that's what they think actually, consequently, they don't describe anything like the real world in which we live. But you therefore need tools that enable you to visualize that complexity, and that's what Minsky is about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's excellent. And I think one of the things that when I started my journey at college, now 50 years ago, I was a positivist.
Okay.
I felt that, mathematics and logic and empirical science, man, that is the pathway to knowing everything, perfect knowledge. And what I came to realize is that's essentially the Newtonian worldview, linear, direct cause and effect, everything from the bottom up, causal closure, really a neatly defined frame of reference for everything. And in the 20th century, all of the major branches of math and science just broke that paradigm apart, and we still haven't caught up with that yet. And I think
that's basically it.
you're teasing out one of the areas. Economics is a good area where, man, there's a great mythology out there of neo-capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. It's a great mythology. It's a great story, and all you have to do is everybody has to be out for themselves, and what comes out of the sausage maker will be good for everybody, right? So,
in fact, it's not only true there's only one person in the sausage maker. This is the crazy thing. I mean, that's one reason why I got so irritated with neoclassicals and go doing mathematical. Like what they do, as Dan and Scott both know, mathematics, not mathematics. Because that Newtonian frame of reference you mentioned, Newton, of course, solved the two-body problem in terms of gravitational attraction. And then, of course, he could never generalize his equations to more than two bodies, so it became known as the three-body and ultimately n-body problem. And I've forgotten which particular French king it was who established a prize back when this meant something of 100,000 francs to the first person who could solve the three-body problem. And the person who won the award was Poincaré, Henri Poincaré, one of the world's. I mean, when he's somebody you put in the same. If you have your top 10 mathematicians of history, and he's one of them. Okay? And what he did was, in trying to solve it, he actually we call it Poincaré sections. He imagined with a two-body world, you can do it on a sheet of paper. With the three-body world, you've got to be in a box. Okay? So you imagine taking slices through the box and seeing what the gravitational impact was of three objects on each other. And what he found were the beginnings of complexity, because he found infinitely intersecting paths.
Right. We had very small changes in initial conditions ends up with radically different outcomes.
And in fact, we now know that, for example, actually I saw a physicist make this point, an astronomer, saying, if you pick up your pen and move it from one side of your desk to the other, then you have changed the location of Jupiter in 500, about 2,000 years. Okay. So consequently, the predictability that was part of Newton's vision collapsed. Not disappeared. It was, you had a time horizon for the predictability now. And Poincaré did that work in 1899. So, and the economics has stayed on the other side of that ever since. Its main definition came out of 1870. And if you read Phil Murawski, I love Phil, he's a great bloke, but my God, can he waffle. But in his book, I forgot what the name of the book, what he made, Machine Dreams, he made the point that the physics of the 1840s and 30s, maybe 50s, is what economists aped in the 1870s, and it even predates thermodynamics. So they're stuck with what they think is a sophisticated mathematical foundation derived from physics, and it's based on physics which was made obsolete in the 1850s, 1860s, and completely irrelevant in the 1890s, and we're still using that same nonsense in the 21st century.
Yeah, another one of those examples from the past. I mean, I like your reference to the three-body problem. And again, I'm not an engineer. I just I know a little bit enough to be dangerous. Is the Navier-Stokes equation for fluid flow?
Yeah,
and as I understand it, it's an equation that is perfect because it creates the perfect mathematical structure for that flow, but it is essentially not solvable.
Yeah, it's insoluble.
Except in specific individual conditions or certain constraint conditions.
So, one of my funniest, this is a little joke in a way, but I had, when I worked at Western Sydney, I was still using Mathematica to some extent for my work. I don't anymore. It was just a question of preference. But Mathematica sent this fantastic poster on the polynomial, solving the polynomial. And one of and this is actually Galois' proof back in the 1800s. Galois proved there is no general solution for a polynomial of order 5 or above. Okay, so you can solve. There's a formula for x squared. We all learned that at school. There's one for x cubed. That would take up for a couple of pages of A4 paper. There's one for x to the 4th. There is no equation for x to the 5th. Therefore you can solve x to the 6th minus 1 and things like that, particular instances, but not a generic formula. Anyway, one of the neoclassical staff in my department, a very nice guy, called in because he was having a real problem with one of his PhD students who was trying to do a symbolic input-output table for his national economy. And I said, how many sectors have you got in your input-output table? And he said, 7. I said, right. You're trying to find a symbolic solution to a 7th-order polynomial. Come in and take a look at this poster. So they are ignorant of the foundations of mathematics past what they learn in their own instruction sets. And therefore they're incredibly complicated, which is partly Hayek's old thing, but they're not complex. And they don't realize, wonder the world, you've got to throw out everything you thought you knew in the previous
Can I ask
world.
a layman question, guys? Because to the 7th order, I'm curious. Is that 7 different chaotic? What's that?
X to the 7th. It's he's going a plus bx plus cx squared plus dx to the 3rd plus dx to the 4th. Once you get to the 5th, you can no longer solve the equation. There is no solution.
There's no predictability. It's provable. That's what Poincaré did.
You cannot give a symbolic answer. So you can actually estimate it and so on, but you cannot give a symbolic answer to that. Now, most people intuitively think, well, if you can solve x squared, you can solve everything beyond it. And so there's this belief in a limitless capability of mathematics. Yeah. What mathematicians know is a whole range of areas in which it's limited. The classic being, I think it's a Galois theorem, I'm not quite sure which one. But no, Godel, any
Incomplete.
mathematical system must have things it assumes. It can't be self-referential.
Yeah, and that's by the way, Steve, that was the thing that tripped me over. I was studying symbolic logic and ran up against Gödel's incompleteness
Yeah,
theorems, and it is numbing to the mind to imagine that when you are dealing with self-referential systems, that could be language, could be logic, even arithmetic can be structured in ways that are self-referential. Algebra
yeah,
can refer, the variable can refer to itself. Anytime you're in a self-referential system that's big enough and powerful enough to do some interesting stuff, you run into these undefinable, indiscernible, impossible systems. And the proofs of them boil down to a very simple concept of self-reference. And one of the examples that I like to use is simply this statement is what? Okay, so this statement is true. It's
yeah,
true and it's simple and everybody gets it, no problem. Now, what if you say this statement is false? If that
yeah,
statement is true, it denies itself. But if you
yeah,
say this statement is false, then it's rehabilitated. And so that logical impossibility of getting through the paradox of self-referential processes is what tripped up Gödel. It tripped up Alan Turing with the halting problem. Anytime you end up with infinite regress,
yeah,
you are dealing with this self-referential problem, which sits at the heart. It sits at the heart of quantum physics as well. So
yeah.
that, to me, is part of why we have not come to grips with the failure of the Newtonian worldview and the clockwork world, is because these things are, from that framework, are absolutely incomprehensible.
Yeah, and that's the trouble because mathematicians have had to come to grips with that, and so have physicists. So they've built techniques that enable you to reach an answer even if you can't reach a solution.
Right.
And that wisdom is something which economics has insulated itself from, and that's why it's so damn, one of the many reasons that it's so damn dangerous.
Hey, Steve,
Yeah.
on a little bit of a side note, I was listening to some sort of an economic report on the radio today, and I thought to myself, I made a mental note. I was going to say, I want to ask Steve about supply and demand curves in general. I
Yeah.
mean, I know they're kind of like the antithesis of because it's not as simple as a supply. But is there any utility of a supply and demand
No, I mean,
thinking? No.
when I rewrite debunking economics, I've got to keep on putting off when I'm going to start writing the third and final edition of it. But the current version starts with the theory of demand and shows the demand curve can't be derived. And this next one is about the supply curve, and that can't be derived. And I'm going to change the order and start with the supply curve because that's an empirical fallacy. And it's a provable empirical fallacy. And people that have proven it include Alan Blinder, who was the deputy chair of the Federal Reserve at one stage, vice president of the American Economic Association, and he went in search of explanations for sticky prices. And because he was such a prestigious personality, got a huge grant that enabled him to use PhD students to interview corporations that were responsible literally for 15% of America's manufacturing GDP. And in that, he found 89% of those firms reported falling or constant marginal cost curves. And once you have falling or constant, the definition of the supply curve is the marginal cost curve above average price, okay? Average cost. So what Blinder found was there is no such thing. Now, ironically, if you go and check his textbook, do you find his research in the textbook? And the answer is no. He repeats the religion. So I want to say right from the very outset, you can't even draw a supply curve. So the whole
Steve,
mental framework goes wrong. Yeah.
can I ask you, Steve, to explain that a little bit?
Yeah.
Is the problem that, trying to construct a curve which shows, the relationship of, the output of supply to the cost of supply, is a problem of averaging across many circumstances, and the circumstances are not meeting the average, or because from a conceptual standpoint, or is it just oversimplifying a situation that is far too complex to put into that kind of a simple puzzle?
The framework's simply wrong. This is because what it tells you is that cost of production rises as output rises. Okay, that's the
if you do not add capital to the system, then isn't there some truth to that in some processes that you're trying to get more supply out of a fixed infrastructure of capital,
and nobody does that. Okay.
Understood. So it's idealized. The problem is it's an idealized structure that really doesn't apply to the real
Bingo.
world.
Well, and if it's not even ideal, it's the sort of bullshit that would happen if you let economists design a factory. I mean, if you read Mankiw, unfortunately I have, and Blinder and so on, their explanation for why production falls as volume rises is workers start bumping into each other, trying to manipulate the controls of the same machine. Now, any engineer who designed a factory like that would be sacked, okay? Because they're designed to be maximum efficiency at maximum capacity.
Maximum capacity.
Yeah, and what if you have a production line, let's say you've got a factory with 5 production lines, and you have enough demand for 4 production lines, then you leave one idle. You don't spread 80% of your staff, across 100% of your equipment. You have 80% of your staff working 80% of your equipment, and when the demand rises, then you turn on the 5th production line. So what they've got is people being stupid. And if you read it, you literally go, Mankiw, what is Mankew's explanation for rising cost? It's because employers are stupid and design stupid systems, and workers fall over each other trying to run them. That's not the real world. That'd be, any firm that did that would be out of business. So when you look at the actual cost structure of firms, they have declining fixed costs follow a rectangular hyperbola. Okay, you've built the damn stuff, you've got all the lines, you've got to amortize that, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the higher the volume, the per unit cost drops is a strict rectangular hyperbola. When you look at the variable costs, they decline with output. Even the simplest possible illustration of that, you've got air conditioning for an enormous factory. You've only got one worker inside there. The amount of power you need to keep that worker at the temperature that's comfortable, it's the entire factory. It's a waste. 2 workers, it's less. 3 workers, etc.
Yeah.
You design it when you've got a full factory, and therefore at that point, okay. So what you find is all your costs decline with output. So you cannot use the variable costs, which they use, the cost per unit. If you use that for your pricing, you'd be setting a price far below your cost of production.
Yeah.
And therefore, but that is the basis of the rising supply curve.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a very convenient fallacy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So it's a fallacy, and it's convenient because it makes a nice there's an intuitive case for it, but it's actually a fallacy. And so everything that's built off of that relationship of supply curves and demand curves, and it's all and I remember there's the consumer welfare, the difference between marginal costs and what's going to be the extra value that's going to be split between the producer and the consumer.
Yeah.
So all of that stuff is built on a fallacy that really doesn't describe the real world. It's a much more complicated world. Yeah.
Yeah. And what that means is you get you caught in the whole idea of marginal this and marginal that, and maximizing utilities, the gap between utility, total utility and total cost, et cetera, and it's all fallacious. If you try to find where it came from, I mean, I think what neoclassical economists did is imagine a factory as like a stomach. You can throw in port one day and cherries the next, and the factory will produce you the day after. So they make a sort of stomach analogy for a factory. No way is a factory like a stomach. You've got to provide exactly what the factory expects as inputs. So all the variable input stuff, which is the idea of an isoquant, that's just a mapping of the idea of indifference curve. So they've got a complete similarity between how they model consumption and how they model production. And the model of production is really just an inverted version of the model of consumption.
Yeah.
Both are wrong, but the one which is most empirically obviously wrong is the theory of supply.
Okay. So is the theory of a demand curve in terms of, as the price goes up, there will be resistance to purchasing, and so the demand will fall as the price goes up. Is that basically valid, or does that have some inconsistencies as well?
That is actually a composition error. So like the supply side is just simply wrong about how an individual factory works, wrong from the very unit of analysis they're wrong. For the consumer, you can mythologically imagine that consumers are sitting there trying to maximize the utility. And when you do that, you can get a downward sloping individual demand curve, and you can compensate for income. So you get what they call a Hicksian compensated downward sloping individual demand curve. But the Hicksian model assumes changing price does not change your income. So if you think about what they do, they've got a single point. Which way I've got to do this? I'm not sure which it shows up on the screen. But a single point where that's the income and the good on the vertical axis, and then they vary the price for the one on the horizontal. Okay, and that's so changing price doesn't change your income. But when you then say, well, let's look at a market. What's the demand for apples in the overall market rather than demand for apples from individual consumer? Then some of the people in the economy that you're measuring are going to be apple consumers and apple producers. So you change the price, you do change their income. That fixed point disappears. And then under what conditions do you get the same results of a downward sloping demand curve? The only outcome is it must be in a world where there is consumers have what they call homothetic preferences, which means your income curves are parallel. The more income you earn, you fundamentally we're the same. Okay, all the consumers are the same. But the horrible thing is the products are also the same. So if you double your income or double your prices, double income, you'll consume twice exactly the same ratio. Engel's curve is a straight line. That means you cannot distinguish between a toilet roll and a hamburger. Okay, it's either the same thing. So that's just nonsense. So it reduces to being accurate in a one commodity world. So total fallacy of conversation.
Right. So there's lots of substitutions, and there's certain items that have a you'll pay almost anything for a roll of toilet paper under certain circumstances, right?
And it is just a whole series of fallacies which they overlook because they like the story that the underlying parable tells, and this is what's so criminal about them, and that's why what's wrong with the neoclassical theory of demand is that it leaves up the distribution of income. Okay? Because if you change the distribution of income, you do change what people will buy collectively and individually. So you have to acknowledge that, and that therefore means you have to have a theory of class as part of your social structure. And what do they not have? A theory of class. So all these huge holes in the neoclassical vision. And yet, because they like the underlying parable, they wave their hands and ignore all this stuff. And you have a theory of supply, which is empirically wrong, a theory of demand, which has a fallacy of composition to it. It's just, you look at it and you think, it's such an elaborate worldview, and they do not want to leave the worldview behind. But if any chink in it anywhere, the whole thing falls apart. So here's Binder finding that supply curve does not exist. What does he teach his students? Diminishing marginal productivity. The same nonsense you get in Mancure.
I have to admit, I don't have a deep background in economics.
Lucky you.
Well, I don't know. But I have felt a sense that, there are problems in what I hear as sort of the metaphysical, or the narrative of the neoliberal capitalism, and all the happy face that goes along with it. And one of the things that just struck me as problematic is, from sort of my maybe more mathematical background, exponential curves are a wonderful, beautiful thing in mathematics. But there is no such thing in the real world. And anytime I see somebody espousing something, that is, sort of the forecasting out of something based upon an exponential curve. It's just not true. It may be that way for a little while, but it's not going to go on forever. And yet there's this sense in neoclassical economics that growth is a forever prospect, and all we need to do is just keep those markets cooking, and and innovation and entrepreneurs and putting capital, and all of this stuff is just going to be hunky dory, and we're all on this exponential growth curve. And simple examples of how where that fails is the bacteria in the petri dish are all pretty happy. They're pretty happy when things start out. Really, really happy when things start out. And, depending upon the size of the petri dish, 24 hours later, they've eaten up all the agar or whatever, and they all die.
Yeah.
So you have a systemic collapse from this, from the real world, when, at the beginning stages, it looked like a nice, exponential curve. Everybody's going to be happy forever.
And that's that's fundamentally what Minsky is designed to model, because if you look at the simplest model of this predator-prey model, if you have one of the assumptions of the predator model is that the predators have an infinite food supply. But then you whack in prey have an infinite food supply. Then you whack in predators who've got a fixed food supply, which of course is the predators, the prey themselves. And what you get is cyclical behavior. You don't get exponential rise in the number of prey or exponential fall in the predators. You get a cyclical outcome coming out of it. And that's what the real world is full of, cyclical outcomes in a constrained system. And neoclassicals, they love throwing around the insult that if you talk about limits to growth, you're a Malthusian. Yes, I am a Malthusian. Fuck off, you're an exponential fantasist. But they literally think that as you say, exponential.
Well, Malthus was also an exponential, claiming that one item, maybe it's not an exponential problem, but the fact that one item population is going in this direction. If you assume a fixed food supply, clearly that's the bacteria in the petri dish, and they're all they're all going to die, and so, but the world changes, and so we had developments in agriculture that created a much greater food supply than was anticipated, that Malthus anticipated. So it's all a moving part, and it's all a dynamic system. Yeah. And at some point, though, a system runs into constraints.
Oh, and this is in terms of that food availability, it's actually, they call it the green revolution. It's actually the brown revolution, because the basis of our huge food output is the Haber process. And that's, taking petroleum and turning it into ammonia and using it as fertilizer. So the great weakness of our system is we've only got this huge increase in food output because we're effectively living off fossils from 80 million years ago, consuming them. And at some point, that food supply is going to run out. And when it does, we'll suddenly find we've got population 4 times what we can sustain with non-brown technology food systems.
Yeah, and one of the other dynamics is it seems to be at play now in the 21st century is that as countries have become wealthy, the birth rate has declined. And even the U.S. now, particularly with COVID, it's somewhere close to the replacement rate, much more stable population than was anticipated. So again, that was an exponential assumption that isn't a fixed factor; it's a variable factor. And there seems to be this counter result of increasing affluence, creating a decrease in the birth rate.
In fact, that was one of the points on which Nordhaus attacked the limits to growth. And it's actually a good point to be discussing, but this is the 50th anniversary, the publication of the limits to growth. And Forrester wrote a beautiful reply, which was not published by I think it was the Economic Journal that published Nordhaus's critique.
Yeah.
And Nordhaus assumed equilibrium in every the rest of the system, and then showed that with the equations of the limits to growth, you got increasing population out of increasing affluence. But what Forrester showed is, I'm sorry, you cannot hold ceteris paribus on a complex system. The rest of it is moving. So when we include the movements in our model and we get them increasing affluence, we get a decreasing birth rate, which is the real world phenomenon. So this inability to think in a complex systems terms is one reason why economists rejected the technology of the limits to growth. And look where we are now.
Yeah.
We're now experiencing those limits to growth.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, I can jump in here.
Okay.
Because I want two things. I'm going to give you guys an option on which way to go. Partially, I would like George to explain a little bit about the Boston long now, complexity, the organization, because I really wanted to be able to bring you part of the goal for today's event was to see how Steve could actually interact with the complexity sprints, the weekends, or the events that happen quarterly with a project that George is involved with. Okay, so this represents option A to choose about and talk about. Okay, now
Yep, sure.
the other option is on Steve's side of the thing, and Steve, I don't know if you have your computer available yet, but you were able to pull up Minsky and you do this really beautiful like time lapse, I think, of a system with the butterfly effect.
Oh, you mean the Lorenz model?
The Lorenz model.
Let's let George talk, and I'll locate my Lorenz model in Minsky.
Okay, I'm excited. George, are you up for the challenge to a little bit of self-explanation?
So, I've become very interested in how we look at the future and how we approach this future. And one of the organizations that does that is in the Long Now Foundation, headquartered in San Francisco.
Yeah.
But there are a couple of chapters, if you want to call them that, that started up elsewhere. And one started up in Boston. And part of what we're trying to do is to encourage people to get away from short-termism, short-term thinking, short-term assumptions, and really expand their horizon out to look at the long term. And the longer you go, the more uncertain and unpredictable and dynamic the system is. So you can no longer really rely on that kind of engineering practical thinking you have to imagine, you have to aspire, you have to kind of be moved by things that are much more kind of aspirational in nature than concrete. And so it's been an interesting journey to work with speakers and bring them into the community to get those ideas discussed. But as I said earlier, one of the things that excites me is complexity science itself. As the Newtonian world unraveled, we had quantum physics, electromagnetism, relativity, quantum physics, the hard sciences kind of fraying around the edges. You had mathematics kind of going right to the core with Turing and Gödel, and then complexity science comes along, with some early stages in cybernetics and some of the early thinkers that now finds the potency of the dynamism of living systems and even mechanical systems, the way they actually operate in reality, complex systems. And I think there are some threads within complexity science that can help us get a better framework for conceptualizing how the world works in a kind of worldview that will fit that dynamic. So there's an organization that's called Complexity Weekend. Some of the people that have started it up are kind of graduates from programs at the Santa Fe Institute.
Yep.
They are trying to build a worldwide online community of practice where people who are involved in different aspects of complexity science from a practical standpoint, whether it's cryptographic systems and blockchain or biomimicry or working the mathematics of, the complex mathematics, bring these individuals together in a self-organizing manner, a self-organized system, if you will, to share ideas, share perspectives, and to bounce off of each other as a way of helping to move each person in their individual domain forward by cross-cutting, ideas from other types of domains, and seeing where this distributed autonomous organization of folks can go. So that's what Complexity Weekend is. It does 2 weekend sections per year, and then there are monthly events that they call heartbeat events, which are smaller sessions. They've got asynchronous text communication that can draw people across the globe into a conversation around a particular thread. They've also got synchronous time get-togethers, which are done with an interesting little technology called Gather. So you pretend you're in this little room and you march around, and then you go into one of the rooms, and all of a sudden you're on a call like this with one other person or 10 other people, or it could be a plenary session where there are 100 people listening in, and so they chunk out their sessions in 1 hour blocks, so you have a time frame. But for the weekend itself, it goes over 48 hours, and essentially circles the globe, and has participants all around the world. And it's I've been in one of those. I'm going to facilitate in an upcoming Heartbeat event on this concept of how do we look at complexity science and worldview. I'm impressed with the quality of the people that are at the at these tables, and the leadership that's involved in this program, and I think it's very interesting. This is an entirely new way to do call it practice, complexities, a scientific practice for those practitioners that are involved in the field to get together in this kind of a model is so different than the traditional academic model, and it's quite refreshing, and it's also unpredictable, and it'll be very interesting to see how this develops as it goes forward.
Steve, I think that's one thing that we've all been challenged with, is that it's you have the message. It's about the deliverability, and I think when I started to get more into the academic world, I started reading thinkers like Steven Pinker. And let's use him as an example. And as an academic, he's thinking, do I publish in the journals, or do I publish, something for popular literature? It's got enough staying power that my books out there, in the world will be part of my legacy. It's as good as publishing in terms of public record in a journal, right? And so there's this shift with academics to say, do I stay out of the journal, or do I go into something where mainstream can actually be? And correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but you've been fighting this war for 20 years, right? I mean, right?
Partly what George is talking about there is very cross-disciplinary, and one of the dangers of the journals is they're very much silo approach, and when you learn about complex systems, it's very hard to maintain silos, but it's very hard to work out an alternative as well. So I would be. Thank you. I'm getting it. Need a cake.
That's
here.
your tea?
Life in Thailand is well fed. I'll just say that much. I try as much as I can to be across a number of different silos. So I've got into climate change work, and first thing I did was read the climate scientists, not the climate economists. And so the idea that sort of complexity weekend is a very sensible way of saying, well, here's what I'm doing in my field. You might find that useful in yours, and that breaks down silos, and that goes against the journal approach, Daniel, because in the journals you'll just get read normally by people from that same silo. So the book approach, or something which opens up other areas. And I would like to be part of that, George. So
Yeah.
in two ways. One is to show Minsky as a potential tool for those who want to do mathematical simulations of complex systems. And on the other side is showing how economics itself is a complex system using Minsky.
So Daniel, I think, has the information. He can probably share it with you about this well, it's actually this weekend, so it may be too soon, but there will be another weekend and then events. So the other thing, Daniel, I think we ought to have another conversation at some point about the replication crisis and the issue of the way journals determine how publication decisions are made. And I have a friend, Steve, in Boston, that came out with a book a year ago on Benoullis' fallacy, and fascinating book about the history of statistics and the fact that most modern statistical techniques are based upon a fallacy, and it's the difference between the way Bernoulli structured the very earliest thinking about it and the way Bayes and Bayesian techniques, probability theory actually works. So there's a disconnect between probability analysis under Bayes and the way statistics works under the modern statistical methods. And it was a very, very convenient fallacy for the early developers of statistical techniques whose primary focus was on promoting eugenics.
All right. This sounds a bit like it might be related to the ergodic versus non-ergodic hypothesis. Have you seen the work of Oola Peters on that front?
I haven't. The young writer that wrote this book is Aubrey Clayton. Is his name? The young writer, and the Bernouilli's fallacy. It's really a
well, we might actually get Daniel to exchange notes there, because a guy called Oola Peters is a pure mathematician and statistician that started looking at how economists use statistics, and what they're basically doing in finance is say, if you toss a coin and it's you're going to get 60% for one value and 40% for another, what should you do this or not take this gamble, depending upon what the returns are? And it's working in a world where you can do the same test 100 times, but the real world is sequential. Okay, so it sounds very, very related. So you've got a mental framework that I used to teach my students is to say, here's what the finance textbook says you should choose the result with a higher expected value. And so, but you don't get the expected value. You get either A or B. Okay, and therefore, can you afford, if A is a loss and B is a gain, and the overall thing says, well, overall you expect it is positive, can you afford to lose what happens if A turns up? If the answer is no, do not take the gamble. But if you can do it 100 times, obviously you choose the one with the higher expected value, because you will get it over 100 choices. So this sounds very, very similar, the wrong statistical framework for analyzing uncertainty.
Right, and one of the problems of the replication crisis is when you have a set of data and you do 100 trials of 100 different regressions against that data, and you use a confidence interval of plus or minus 5% with a 95% confidence. That means 1 out of 20 times you're going to get a spurious correlation. And so if you keep throwing things at the same data set, eventually you'll by statistical you can statistically realize that you'll get a positive correlation, completely spurious, but you'll get a positive correlation 1 out of 20 times. And if you've been trying a data set and keep trying, eventually you'll get an answer that looks good, but it'll be wrong. And the journals, nobody sees that backstory. Nobody sees how many times somebody tried to fit the data to particular equations to make it work. So,
and in the real world too, if you have a 95% chance of a positive outcome and a 5% of disaster, you're going to fail, because that 5% will happen. So this is the same sort of thing. It's thinking in a a sort of latitudinal when we live in a
Yeah, that's
longitudinal
right.
world.
That's the Black Swan. Talib's point about the Black Swan events.
Yeah.
Um,
So we have an economics based on entirely the wrong mathematics, and that's in the econometrics as well as the theoretical logic of economics itself, which is one of the travesties. George, have you seen Minsky, by the way?
I have not. I'd love to see
How
it.
about I do it because that's actually
Yay.
we had a practical contribution to complexity week. It'd be saying, why don't you use Minsky for your modeling as a way of showing what complex systems are, rather than mathematical and so on and so forth. Not because it's more powerful; it certainly isn't, but it lets you visualize better. So I'll just actually just go and share my screen here, and this is actually when I share it. First, I'm going to get the cascading windows effect here. Let's get rid of that. Oh, thanks, honey. Thanks, fruit as well. Okay, let's look at that's a model of a that was a model of the pandemic. But let's quickly run Minsky here. So this is the Lorenz equations, which are extremely simple. The rate of change of x is a times y minus x. A very, very simple set of. So you've got 3 constants and 3 parameters, and when you simulate it, you get the result of 3 systems. There's 3 equilibria, all of which are unstable. So I'm just actually slowly demonstrating the dynamics here. And the bottom, the top x and y vary radically, but when you look in a 3-dimensional sense, you see what's turning up down below. So there are 3 equilibria, all of which are unstable. We started right near one of the equilibria and got repelled dramatically, and now it's going to continue cycling around. So you can see the same sort of simulation, of course, in Mathematica or in MATLAB or any of a huge range of programs. But what MathCAD lets you do is run a simulation like that and see it dynamically over time, and then vary your parameters and see what happens as well to your system in a way that you can't do with most of the other programs. So that's it as a tool. And then what it adds, which is unique, is actually being exploited here by a guy who's actually, we only met him a couple of weeks ago. He's a factory worker. He doesn't done anything past high school, university, high school mathematics, but he's built this brilliant system to simulate a pandemic using Minsky.
Oh my!
Okay, and this, I'm running it rather rapidly here, but you can actually turn on and off various controls. So turn on a federal state of emergency, ban international travel, bring in social distancing, make markets, shut the government down, shut the local government down, close restaurants, close personal services, and suddenly you get in control of it, and then you decide, oh, well, it's actually working. Now let's turn off some of those controls, and you get back in the exponential phase of the process once more. And that the main thing which is making that, I'm trying to bring it up right now, is what we call the Godley table. So this table of interactions is actually generating, I think there's 25 columns here, and this generates a 25-dimensional model where it's internally consistent because the program is making sure that all your inputs and outputs are balanced using its assets minus liabilities minus equity equals 0. So it's, I'll just actually stop sharing here. Hang on a second. So that's Minsky as a tool, and I'd be happy to demonstrate that and say, in terms of if you actually want to visualize complex systems, then it's a much more effective visualization tool than the static stuff fundamentally you get out of MathCAD. Mathematics.
I suspect many of the technical folks at Complexity Weekend would be very familiar with what you're saying and probably even use the tool. The two thoughts that occurred to me. One is I have been unable to really track down the source of the phrase butterfly effect because it's used in the context of meteorology, saying the flap of a butterfly's wings can affect the course of the storm 1,000 miles away. But it seems a lot more likely that somebody in Lorenz's laboratory, as they're exploring this phenomenon and they're finding the attractor that's showing up when they run these equations, it looks like a butterfly.
Exactly.
So,
that's where it did come from.
That's what I suspected, but I haven't found a reference for that.
It's actually, Lorenz's paper's in 1963, so it's what I call it deterministic aperiodic flow.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in that, when he actually, how do you describe the actual structure of the attractor? And that's where the idea of the butterfly. I'm not quite certain like the phrase is in that paper. I don't think it is.
Yeah.
I think it turned up shortly afterwards, and people discussing what does it look like.
Yeah.
It looks like a butterfly.
Yeah, and then they borrowed it to use the example of intermediality.
But that would be an interesting thing, though. So there's a logical explanation there, George, because the thing is that even though it may not have been uttered in a text, what I think Steve's very valid in the point in pointing out that this was the seminal work that initiated whatever that effect was.
Right,
and
right. Yeah, and anybody that sees that curve that comes out of that equation, the results that you were running, yeah, it looks like a butterfly. So it makes perfect sense that it came up. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is that Aubrey Clayton, the mathematician I mentioned earlier, had an article in Nautilus magazine early in the pandemic, and his claim in that article was that the virus COVID had gotten inside of our OODA loop. And I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but the OODA loop was a training mnemonic used for fighter pilots by the U.S. Fighter squadrons in World War II. And I think it's observation, orientation, decision, and feedback. It's kind of like that training structure. And using that training structure, the U.S. fighters with lesser equipment were able to significantly outfight the German fighters because they'd had that particular kind of training. And what it points out is that we've been in conflict. We were in conflict, still are, with the virus. The virus changes and morphs and reacts in the environment faster than we are able to react.
Yeah.
So, as you point out, the exponential phase of expansion of the virus, moves past our ability to respond to be able to meet that challenge. So we're always behind. And that behind is enough to let this particular virus get out of control, whereas SARS-CoV-1 or Ebola hasn't had those same kind of characteristics. This one is the one that, since the Spanish flu was the last one that did it, and now COVID does it now. And if we're always making our decisions, and this is probably a good message for economists and financial people anyway. If you're making your decisions based upon historical data, you're always going to be behind what's happening ahead.
It's reactive behavior.
Reactive as opposed to trying to get ahead of it with this kind of reflective operational capacity of observation, orientation, decision, and feedback. So. The model was great. I think that's it makes visual the other thing that from a philosophical standpoint I'm interested in exploring and finding what people think about is what is fundamentally what's the ontology of an attractor in a complex system with unpredictable behaviors, dynamic conditions. For an attractor to emerge, what does that represent? It's not predictable. It's a set of stable conditions through time, a process of stable conditions through time. So in a sense, it's 4-dimensional or maybe it's 27-dimensional. I don't know, but where does that come from, and why does a dynamic system that's uncertain and unpredictable move to that particular time sequence configuration?
Steve, you have 1 minute. you have 1 minute to answer that question.
I think I won't try to answer that question, but what I will say is we need tools for decision makers to be able to handle complex systems. And at the moment, they have tools for handle systems which are not complex, and therefore they apply to the real world when you have a catastrophe. So one of the main design ideas behind Minsky is to give a dashboard to policymakers and say, here's our simulation of the system which you're actually in. And now I want you to try to make this system behave the way you want it to behave and see what happens when you interact with each other. And holy hell, you cause chaos. Therefore, you can't do the reactive type decision making you've been doing. We've got to pull back.
Right.
And what else might function.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah.
And I've seen that as well. Go ahead.
I think that's beautiful because, and I want to wrap things up. I think, we usually only have Steve for about an hour. So there's a couple things and notes I need to kind of bring in here all together in order to. So first of all, Steve, I would say I've attended, George's shows, or they're not shows, right? Complexity Weekend, right? So the format of them are, I think it's like a 3 to 5 minute presentation, right? We've done this before, right? We've done this before. But I think it's you end up coming on with like one of 4 or 5 other presenters, and you have your 5 to 10 minutes or whatever to present your thing on Zoom. That's what I've seen anyways. George, how easy is it to facilitate it so that Steve is set up to do something like that? Because that's what I envisioned Steve's next step was going to be, with the weekend.
It's not difficult. It's just a process. I think it would be great to have you, because one of the things for me was difficult is managing both a set of asynchronous communications through the chat function, and then this visual participation through an avatar that has to march its way down through a room, and so it takes a little bit getting used to. You'd want to be in that one time, and I don't know. It may be possible for you to sign up you're signed as a participant for this weekend, right, Daniel?
Yeah.
You've signed up. So it might be possible, Steve, to sign up and sort of show up at some point during the 2 4-hour blocks where you just show up, you come into the room, you see, try and navigate your way around, find yourself either to my facilitated event or another, to get a flavor for it, a feel for it, and then I think your Minsky software presentation conversation around that would be great as a facilitated 1-hour segment in one of the next events. Either another Heartbeat event or in the Complexity Weekend coming up in, I think it's in May. I think it'd be great, and I think you'd find that the technical capacities within this group are really rather stunning, and there are some organizations. If you want to, active inference is probably one thread that's strongly represented, and that active inference has its own set of, its own set. It's a lab, set of collaborations going on with people that are doing a lot higher mathematics, and that I'm comfortable with. So I think getting in touch with this group, and the other thing, I don't know if you've had any, if you follow the Santa Fe Institute or have any, looked at any of the programs that they're offering. They've now, they used to be kind of this ivory tower of, academics coming into the ivory tower and mulling around together. They've now created platforms for extended educational opportunities on both complexity science and many programs around complexity science. And they have a winter fellowship program. They have a summer fellowship program, and that's another opportunity to potentially tie into an organization that is less, much more cross-cutting. I mean, one of the principles of the Santa Fe Institute is to really bring people in from disparate disciplines to talk about issues and make that and there may be folks that are involved. I haven't checked their podcast for anything on the kind of the economics, but they may have people working in the area that you've been working in. That's
Okay, well,
another
come
good
on. So
opportunity.
it's actually on this weekend.
Yeah, I'll maybe
Okay.
send you something over, and
I'll come along and I'll participate as much as I can.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, it's a drop-in. It's a drop-in. You can just drop in and sit in
Yeah,
sessions
okay.
and listen. You don't have to say anything. You just kind of get a flavor of it or chime in when you want to chime in. And it's the two cohorts. The two blocks are 5 my time. Your Pacific time. Your Pacific time, Steve?
he's way over.
Bangkok, Indochina.
Well, you'll find you may have your time list may fit you middle of the day. For me, it's 5 a.m. in the morning and 9
Oh
p.m.
God,
at night.
yeah.
But
Probably
for
middle
you,
of
it
the
might be
day
middle
for
of the
me.
day. Yeah. So Daniel can send you over the info, and you can just sign up as a participant and load the software programs to just that interface with it. I think it's a great opportunity, and I want to learn. I want to learn more about the Minsky software and how that operates, and
Yeah,
just to be able to use it, because it's a very good demonstration to see that we do have some tools
yeah,
available to analyze complex systems. It's just not the prevailing thought about cause and effect is it's as you point out, linear, A to B to C.
yeah,
This is cause and effect, and yeah, you may have some branches, and so things get a little complicated. But everybody tries to make models, and humans make models, in their own mind, that are very much linear. And we've got to get comfortable with the uncertainty, the dynamics,
yeah,
with branching fractals, even understanding what that means and why that shows up in nature so often, so that we
yeah,
can understand the level of complexity, the level of sophistication. So you can't use a linear model. It's like the old analogy of using a sledgehammer to make a toothpick
yeah,
or
yeah.
something. Yeah.
Lovely. Oh, well, great to meet you, George, and I'll see you
Yeah.
on the weekend by the sounds of it, when you
Yep.
might be more bleary-eyed than I am.
Cool. Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm a little bleary-eyed now. It's late, but it's been great. It's been a great
Yeah,
chat.
good to chat very much. Scott, we
Yeah.
didn't get a chance to talk about your little topic. We do it next week, though, perhaps.
Oh, that's fine. I didn't want to take up too much talking time tonight, so I was getting
Okay,
too
no.
verbose. I thought I'd kick back after a little while.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good for you, Scott.
Okay. We'll see you all next week, and see you
All
on the
right.
weekend.
Thanks,
Okay.
Daniel.
Bye.
Guys.